Forget what you've been told about Sleeping Beauty. This isn't a tale of a princess kissed awake by a charming prince. This is the story that they didn't want you to know. A story filled with dark secrets, chilling twists, and the unsettling truth behind the fairy tale. What really happened while she slept? Who was the villain? And who was the victim? Today we'll pull back the veil of fantasy to uncover a tale far, far darker than you ever imagined. You think you know Sleeping Beauty? Think again. Hello and welcome back to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we uncover the fascinating, often surprising origins and transformations of the world's most iconic women in mythology, folklore, and apparently fairy tales too now. I'm India as per usual, and today we're venturing into a story that has enchanted generations, but its roots are anything but a fairy tale. That's right, we're talking about Sleeping Beauty. And this is the first of a bit of a mini-series, if you will, where I'll be covering some of the world's favourite women of Disney. And this was suggested over on my YouTube channel, so I figured I'd give it a bit of a crack. Also, did you notice the new intro music? I got it made specially for the podcast, so I really hope you guys like it. And a big thank you to Alex for creating this for me. Another bit of news, it's not really news, but you might be interested. I now have a Blue Sky account, which is the up-and-coming app. I say up-and-coming, it's had about 18 million people sign up to it so far. To replace X or Twitter, I have deleted the Ladies of Lore X account. I never really used it anyway. Not a big fan of Elon. So we've defected over to Blue Sky. So if you are interested in that, I'll put the link in my description of this episode so you can go and follow me over there. I'm mostly going to be posting about the podcast, but also a little bit about me, about my personal life, what I'm doing, what I'm up to, what I'm reading, maybe some dog pictures and just general stuff really. So it'd be really cool to see you over there. But that's enough about me. Let's get on with the show. So from shadowy medieval manuscripts to glittering Disney castles, Sleeping Beauty has been retold countless times. But did you know that the original versions weren't dreamy at all? They are actually downright disturbing. So today we're going to explore the origins of Sleeping Beauty and the first written versions of the tale, how the story evolved over time into the version that we know today, the making of Disney's Sleeping Beauty, and how it both redefined and simplified the narrative, and some modern feminist retellings that reclaim and reimagine the story, and finally, where we can find Sleeping Beauty in modern pop culture from books and TV shows to movies. By the end of this episode, you'll see just how far this story has travelled, from darkness to Disney and beyond. So settle in, because it's time to spin this tale. Do you see what I did there? And one last thing before I go on. This episode does contain themes of sexual assault, so trigger warning for that. Right, let's crack on. The tale of Sleeping Beauty has ancient roots, stretching back centuries before Disney ever laid claim to it. The first version we know of appears in a medieval French text called Perceforest, written in the 14th century. Perceforest is a 14th century prose romance that bridges the gap between ancient myth and Arthurian legend. It's a sprawling epic filled with night, magic, and love, but nestled within its pages is one of the earliest versions of Sleeping Beauty. The tale is about a maiden named Zelandine, and it unfolds with some striking similarities to the Sleeping Beauty we know today. Zelandine falls in love with a knight named Troilus. However, due to a series of divine and familial conflicts, Zelandine pricks her finger on a spindle and falls into an enchanted sleep. Sounds pretty familiar, right? But here's where things take a bit of a turn. Troilus, guided by divine intervention, finds Zelandine and realises that she's under a spell. And while she's asleep, he assaults her, and they conceive a child. Zelandine wakes up when the baby, born during her sleep, sucks the flax from her finger, the very same flax that caused her enchanted sleep. And this early version of Sleeping Beauty has all the classic elements: the spindle, the enchanted sleep, and the eventual awaking. But it's darker and much more mythological than the versions we know now. Over the centuries, this story was softened and reimagined. When Charles Perrault wrote La Belle au Bois Dormant in 1697, and later on when the Brothers Grimm again reinterpreted the tale, they removed the darker elements, replacing the baby with a chaste kiss as a spellbreaker. And what's fascinating about Perseforest is how it weaves classical mythology into its chivalric tales. The spindle, for example, could symbolise fate, much like the threads spun by the Greek fates or the Norns in Norse mythology. And the romance also bridges pagan and Christian themes, adding depth to Zelandine's story. In 1634, we see a more fleshed out version of the story in Guillaume Baptiste Basile's Pentamerone. Written in Neapolitan dialect, it's considered the first major collection of European fairy tales, and it influenced later works like Perrault's Cinderella and the Brothers Grimm's Rapunzel. Basile's tales are rich with magic, folklore, and a healthy dose of earthy humour, but again they're also darker than the versions we're familiar with. In Sun, Moon, and Thalia, we meet Thalia, a beautiful princess doomed by a prophecy. Astrologers warn her family that she'll be endangered by a splinter of flax, and despite their efforts to protect her, Thalia pricks her finger on flax and falls into a death-like sleep. Sounds familiar again? But again, here is where things get different, and much darker. Believing Thalia is dead, her family abandons her in a remote palace. Years later, a wandering king discovers her sleeping body. Enchanted by her beauty, he tries to awaken her. But when that fails, he assaults her in her sleep. While Thalia remains unaware, she gives birth to twins named Sun and Moon. One day, one of the babies sucks the splinter of flax from her finger, breaking the spell and waking her, much like in Perseforest. Now awake, Thalia meets her children and eventually the king, who confesses to her what happened. But the story's not over yet, and the king's jealous wife discovers Thalia and her twins Sun and Moon and plots to destroy them. She tricks the king into bringing the children to the palace, intending to have them killed and served to him as a meal. However, the cook saves them at the last minute, substituting lamb instead. The queen doesn't want to give up. She's hell-bent on destroying all of them, and she lures Thalia into the palace and orders her to be burned alive. Before her plan succeeds, the king intervenes, learns of her treachery, and sentences the queen to the same fiery fate. Thalia and the king marry, living happily with their children, and the queen's schemes reflect the dark and vengeful themes of early fairy tales. So let that sink in for a minute. A sleeping maiden, an assault, a jealous queen, attempted cannibalism. It couldn't be further from the Disney version that we grew up with. And also, the queen is going after the wrong people here, really, isn't she? Like, the real villain in the story is most definitely the king. Like, if I was going to put anyone in a pie, it would probably be the king. But I digress. So these versions reflect a much darker, more brutal world where women's bodies were seen as commodities, not really respected at all, and fairy tales weren't meant to comfort. They were moralistic, often serving as warnings or reflections of societal fears. And this theme continued in later versions, but they were significantly softer, as I said, and they moved away from this more medieval, moralistic fairy tale theme. So let's have a look at some later versions. By the late 17th century, the tale started to take on a more familiar shape. Enter Charles Perrault, the French author who published La Belle au Bois dormant, or The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, in 1697. As always, I may very well have pronounced that wrong. Apologies if I have tried. Perrault, as I said, softened the story significantly. Thalia becomes Aurora. The prophecy of her sleep is cast by a wicked fairy, and the prince awakens her with a kiss. No assault, no unplanned twins, although I'd argue we probably shouldn't be kissing strangers while they're asleep. Consent is sexy, guys. Consent is sexy. But Perrault still did retain some of the darker elements. After Aurora and the prince marry, his ogress mother, yes, his mum was an ogre, tries to eat Aurora and their children. In true fairy tale fashion, the ogress ends up falling into a pit of snakes, and the happy couple finally get their happily ever after. So, while Perrault's version still has these grim elements, it also introduces some of the more magical, romantic tropes that we associate with Sleeping Beauty today. The idea of love's true kiss, an enchanted castle, and the idea of true love breaking the curse all come from this very retelling. And if we fast forward again to the 19th century, we get the Brothers Grimm version, Little Briar Rose. Now, the Grimms removed the ogress mother-in-law storyline and streamlined the story to focus on the curse, the 100 years of sleep, and the prince's rescue. So what I'll do is I'll tell you their story, as it's probably the one that we all know most outside of the Disney version. Once upon a time, a king and queen finally had the daughter they'd always dreamed of. To celebrate, they invited 12 wise women, fairies in some versions, to bless the princess with gifts of beauty, grace, and more. But there was a problem. There were 13 wise women in the kingdom, and they only had enough gold plates for 12. The 13th, feeling snubbed, crashed the party and cursed the princess. She declared that on her 15th birthday, the princess would prick her finger on a spindle and die. Luckily, the 12th fairy hadn't yet given her blessing and softened the curse. Instead of dying, the princess would instead fall into a deep sleep for 100 years, only to be awakened by a prince's kiss. Despite the king's efforts to ban all spindles, fate is tricky. On her 15th birthday, the princess finds a spinning wheel in a hidden tower, pricks her finger, and falls asleep. And it wasn't just her. The entire castle was enchanted to sleep, surrounded by a thorny hedge that grew so dense it trapped anyone who tried to enter. Over the years, countless princes failed, but after 100 years, one brave prince made it through. The briars miraculously parted for him, and he found the princess in her enchanted sleep. With a kiss, he broke the spell, waking her and the entire castle. They married, and of course, lived happily ever after. So the Grimms did make some changes once again, introducing the image of this thorny hedge surrounding the castle, which you probably are familiar with from the movie. And they once again emphasised the moral lesson that good triumphs over evil, and patience is rewarded. So by the Victorian era, Sleeping Beauty had become a tale of romance and virtue. Victorian ideals of womanhood, so purity, beauty, and obedience, shaped how the story was told and understood. And when Disney created Sleeping Beauty in 1959, they blended all of the versions I have just told you. But the grim version is probably the most recognisable, with that briar hedge and the romanticised ending. This isn't a movie podcast, but let's talk about the Disney version for just a sec. In 1959, Walt Disney brought Sleeping Beauty to the big screen, and his version became the definitive one for most of us. But making the film was no small feat. Disney wanted Sleeping Beauty to look like no other animated film, and the art style was inspired by medieval tapestries and illuminated manuscripts, thanks to the visionary work of Eyvind Earle, who was the film's production designer. The animation process was painstakingly detailed. Some scenes took months to complete, with backgrounds that were almost entirely hand-painted. And I have a book about the making of every single Disney movie. It's a really, really interesting book. And the Sleeping Beauty part has always fascinated me because they have these hand-painted backgrounds and then they sort of put a film over the top of it for the animation. I would really, really encourage you, even if you're not really into the movie itself, just to have a look at that on YouTube because it's so incredible to look at how they actually made that movie. And Disney also used Tchaikovsky's ballet score as the foundation for the film's music, so songs like Once Upon a Dream are actually adaptations of melodies from the ballet. And because of all of this and the painstaking detail that went into it, the film took nearly a decade to complete and cost $6 million, which was an enormous sum of money at that time. Unfortunately, it wasn't a box office success at all when it was first released, and critics called it too formal, and audiences found Aurora to be too passive. And Aurora's passivity is one of the movie's main critiques. She actually only has 18 lines of dialogue and is asleep for most of the story. But Maleficent, the villain, steals the show with her commanding presence, memorable design, and chilling transformation into a dragon. Here are some Disney Sleeping Beauty related facts for you. So, in each Disney park across the world, there is a different castle. So it's a different princess's castle. And the one in Disneyland, California, is Sleeping Beauty's castle. Now, that castle actually opened 4 years before the movie premiered. So it was a bit of clever cross-promotion. And Aurora's pink versus blue dress debate in the Disney movie was actually based on a bit of a playful rivalry between two of the animators. So there you go, there are 2 fun facts for you that you can, if you haven't learned anything from this podcast, at least you now know that. So the Disney version is probably the one you know most, and also the version that catapulted the story of Sleeping Beauty into mainstream popularity. But how did the representation of Sleeping Beauty change after the movie? And where can we find her now in modern pop culture? Sleeping Beauty continues to inspire creators across genres in modern times. On television, the story has appeared in shows like Once Upon a Time, where Aurora is part of this interconnected fairy tale universe, multiverse. I've never actually seen that show, although I might have done. I might have seen one episode and it had Rumpelstiltskin in it, and I think it just creeped me out, so I never actually properly tried it. Anyway, the story of Sleeping Beauty has been reimagined, adapted, and referenced in countless ways in modern pop culture. On the big screen, one of the most obvious recent examples is Maleficent and Maleficent the Mistress of Evil. And these movies reframe the story from the perspective of Maleficent, portrayed by Angelina Jolie, and her very pointy cheekbones. And they delve into her backstory, presenting her as a misunderstood anti-hero, rather than just a straightforward evil villain. And these films significantly reshape the narrative, focusing more on themes of betrayal, maternal love, and redemption. And there's also the movie Sleeping Beauty of 2011, which is an Australian film that presents a much more dark and it's pretty unconventional take on the story. And this follows a young student who becomes involved in a mysterious and erotic job where she is drugged and left in a comatose state while wealthy clients interact with her. And this highlights those themes of passivity, agency, and exploitation, probably themes that relate more to the older medieval versions of the tale. And then we also have Into the Woods, the musical film adaptation of Sondheim's Broadway play, which does briefly include Sleeping Beauty as part of a larger interwoven narrative of classic fairy tales, and this has a bit more of a satirical and mature tone. And for some reason unknown to me or to most people, it also includes James Corden. I honestly, really honestly and truthfully do not know why, out of all of the people that they could have chosen, they chose James Corden. But he's in it. I quite like the musical. I've seen it on stage. I've seen the movie. I prefer the stage version, but I digress. Down on the small screen, as I said, we have Once Upon a Time, which I'm told features multiple references to Sleeping Beauty, and the character Aurora is introduced in season 2, alongside the cursed thorny briar motif. I can't explain that anymore because I haven't seen it, but the show also does incorporate Maleficent, giving her a complex backstory and intertwining her tale with other characters like Snow White and Emma Swan. And there's also Disney Channel's Descendants franchise, which actually follows the children of iconic villains and heroes. And Maleficent's daughter Mal is a central character, grappling with her mother's legacy while interacting with Aurora's son, Prince Ben. Again, this is something I haven't personally seen, but I have heard that it does have some absolute tunes in it, so I might check it out. And the tale of Sleeping Beauty has crossed into different cultures and actually has inspired some anime series, such as Princess Tutu, where fairy tales like Sleeping Beauty serve as allegorical backdrops with themes of destiny and free will woven into the storyline. Now, I'd like to think that you know me well enough by now to know I'm going to talk books to you, which, if you've been on Book Talk recently, you will hopefully have agreed are political. So here's a few books to add to your TBR if you want some modern takes on Sleeping Beauty. First up, we have Spindle's End by Robin McKinley, which is a reimagined version of Sleeping Beauty where the focus is on the fairy who takes the cursed princess into hiding. McKinley emphasises themes of friendship, identity, and the power of everyday heroism over traditional prince saves princess narratives. And then we have The Sleeper and the Spindle by Neil Gaiman. Now, I am a Neil Gaiman fan. The full cast American Gods audiobook is one of my favourites of all time, and I'm actually currently listening to Lenny Henry read Anansi Boys, so I'm 100% going to read this one. In The Sleeper and the Spindle, Gaiman blends Sleeping Beauty with Snow White, presenting a darker, feminist take on the classic story. In this version, Snow White becomes the saviour who wakes the sleeping princess, challenging traditional gender roles, and I'm not going to lie, sounds absolutely bloody amazing. And many of these retellings explore themes of autonomy, consent, and the power of female relationships, moving far beyond the traditional prince and princess rescue narrative, and bringing fantastic feminist elements into the story, which we absolutely love to see on Ladies of Law. And Sleeping Beauty in the modern day is not just limited to books and movies and TV shows. We also see references to her in video games. In perhaps one of my favourite video game series, Kingdom Hearts, the Sleeping Beauty world features prominently. Aurora, Maleficent, and the Enchanted Forest are integral parts of the storyline, blending that Disney magic with epic battles. And I'd definitely recommend this game. It's super fun and it's cute, and it's just a massive nostalgia trip if you're a millennial in need of some kind of reminder that you were once a child who enjoyed things like I do. And there's also Sleeping Beauty to be found in another of my favourite games, The Wolf Among Us. And this is Telltale Games' episodic adventure game, and it includes references to Sleeping Beauty in its gritty, modern take on fairy tale characters living in a noir-style city. Honestly, if you've not played any of the Telltale games, I'd 100% recommend. They have a Walking Dead series, which I love, and I want to say there's also a Batman series. I think you can play them on pretty much any console and your phone, so go and play those games, please, and tell me when you have. I want to know your thoughts. And Sleeping Beauty has even made her way into haute couture. The princess's imagery of romantic gowns and roses and enchanted settings has influenced designers like Christian Dior and Alexander McQueen, particularly in collections inspired by fairy tales. And fine art interpretations have also popped up, with modern artists like Kiki Smith creating works inspired by Sleeping Beauty, often reinterpreting the tale to explore themes of passivity, femininity, and awakening. So it's pretty clear to see that Sleeping Beauty continues to inspire reinterpretations in modern times that explore the timeless themes of love, fate, and identity, but also adapting the story to resonate with modern audiences and introducing feminist themes and takes. Now, whether through movies, books, or music, the tale remains a sleeping giant, if you will, in the world of pop culture. So, from its grim origins through to its feminist retellings, Sleeping Beauty shows us how stories evolve to reflect values of the times they're being told in. What started as a tale of powerlessness and violence has become a canvas for exploring autonomy, love, and resilience. I really hope you've enjoyed this first episode in this kind of little mini series about the women of Disney. I've got a few more coming up for you, and I really hope that you enjoy them. If you have enjoyed the podcast, please do hit the subscribe or the follow button wherever you're listening to this podcast. I appreciate you so much. I love doing this podcast. I love bringing this to you, and I'm really enjoying all of the comments that I've been getting recently. It's so nice to talk to some of you. Please do go and follow me on Blue Sky if you have it. If you want to have a chat with me on there, shoot me a little... It's not a tweet. I don't know what it is. Shoot me a Blue Sky message, and I would love to see you and have a chat with you. So until next week, I hope you have a wonderful and positive week, and I'll be back to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore.